Last night may have marked a turning point in world history. Roughly 20 Russian drones violated Polish airspace, some of them penetrating deep into the country. Many officials in Europe are not even entertaining the notion that this was an accident. And NATO has already convened the first of many special meetings regarding the situation, a process that has only happened 7 times over the alliance's 76 years. So, today, let's review what actually happened, try to understand why it happened, put this in the broader context of the strategic situation, and then discuss the options that NATO has to respond. And perhaps, NATO has to respond is the operative phrase. But let's begin with what happened. And note that this all just happened. So cue the fog of war, lack of clarity on the details, and warnings that we should be careful about drawing conclusions based on those finer details. In broad strokes, though, we are looking at an air incursion involving Shahed-style drones, similar to the one seen here previously downed on Ukrainian soil. There may have been some of their corresponding decoy drones too. Fully powered Shaheds can do serious damage when they hit their targets, though. Again, as you can see here from stock images from Ukraine. That takes us to last night. Russia was conducting one of its usual massive aerial attacks, which have increased in severity over the past few months because of expanded Russian factory production. Let's go to the map. To situate ourselves, Russia is here, Ukraine is here, Belarus is here, and Poland is here. The entry point of interest is here. One of the drones in question began a normal path over Ukraine. For reasons unclear, it then sharply veered into Belarusian territory, before continuing on deep into Poland. Another took a relatively normal flight path over Ukraine, except it kept on going, again, deep into Poland. A much larger group, more than the 3 that I am using for illustration, also began with a fairly normal flight plan. But again, they crossed over the border into Poland. Some of them ended their journey there, though not as deep as the others. Some flew back to hit targets in Ukraine. As you might imagine, all of the alarm bells went off in Poland, and the Polish military dispatched F-16s to respond. However, the full response was multilateral. Dutch F-35s, German Patriots, Italian AWACS flying out of Estonia, and NATO refueling planes also participated. I want to highlight 2 aspects of what I just said. First, NATO has a reputation of only being able to react slowly and deliberately. That is not true. NATO can be slow and deliberate when it wants to be. But the entire point of having forward deployments is that there is no time to debate. You go and do things, and then maybe you debate about it later. Keep this in mind for when we start discussing Poland invoking the Article 4 clause. But that type of active response is exactly the type of thing that NATO has spent more than a decade preparing for. There is what's called an enhanced forward presence in Poland meant to handle these situations. Second, Patriots. Oh goodness. There is still a misperception that Patriots are not, and never will be used to intercept Russian drones. The argument goes that each interceptor costs millions of dollars, while each drone costs tens of thousands of dollars. No way anyone intelligent would ever use a Patriot to stop a Shahed. Well, for the sake of all that is holy, that argument needs to end now. We had NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte this morning explicitly say that German Patriots were part of the response. The fact of the matter is that, once a Shahed is in the air, the question of whether to shoot it down is a calculation of the cost of the damage that it will cause, versus the cost of the Patriot interceptor. The cost of the Shahed is irrelevant. Shahed pricing versus the amount of damage inflicted, kinetic or monetary, is a calculation for the Kremlin to make, which in turn determines whether Russia launches them in the first place. But again, that does not matter when a Shahed is about to hit you. Now, this does say something about the long-term sustainability of those defensive operations. Western countries need to develop cost-effective solutions to Shahed attacks. But that is a research and development problem, not a task for air defense officers in the heat of the moment. In any case, the response appeared to be effective. There are no reports of Polish casualties, and there is minimal property damage. It is unclear where all of the drones ultimately fell to the ground, but debris has been found in all of these places so far. And that provides a good segue to our next topic: why this happened. Back to the map. Some of the fallen drones are up against Ukraine's border. This would not be the first time that a stray Russian drone has done so. Ukraine uses electronic jamming, which can send the drones to places that they are not supposed to go. But these two locations raise some red flags, because they are very far from the border with Ukraine. Also, Warsaw's international airport had to be shut down, which gives further insight on the depth of the flight paths. One other piece of evidence to remember is that at least one of the drones spent ample time flying over Belarus. It would be curious if Ukraine jammed a drone and it continued to be lost while spending so much time in friendly skies. Belarus claims that it discovered the problem with the Russian drone's flight paths and relayed the information to Poland, claiming to want to reduce the chances of some unintentional escalation spiral. Meanwhile, Russia has looked around, confused about which Russian drones could have possibly found their way into Poland. Where is the evidence that the downed aircraft are of Russian origin, they ask. For their part, the European Union is not buying either of these perspectives, noting that the large number of drones and distant locations are inconsistent with that type of accident. Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk did not describe it as an act of war, but still noted that this is the closest Poland has been to war since World War II. NATO has also pursued a path of caution, not trying to ascribe Russian intent yet, but simultaneously noting that such incidents pose a fundamental threat to the alliance, and so the alliance needs to respond accordingly. I think that it is worth putting this into the broader context of the strategic situation between Russia and the West, before we think about NATO's options going forward. It is hard to imagine the timing of this was incidental. Russia is 2 days away from starting its Zapad 2025 exercises in Belarus. What you are watching right now is file footage from the 2021 exercises, the last time that they occurred. It seems that Russia has been otherwise distracted for the last 3 years. Can't imagine why. Anyway, Zapad is Russian for West, and the purpose of the exercise is to simulate an attack to the West. You know, exactly where Poland is. During the Cold War, such exercises always raise some red flags. They could be a convenient cover story for mobilizing a large number of troops right onto NATO's doorsteps. It is also worth noting that Poland being the target has some key implications for how other allies will think about the attack. Everyone is aware of Donald Trump's streak of NATO skepticism. But one member that he is not skeptical of is Poland. To quote him on the general situation before the attack happened, "We are with Poland all the way, and we will help Poland protect itself." I know, cue the cliché, but this is a time when the leader's words match the leader's true disposition. In fact, here he is meeting with Poland's new president just last week. Poland spends more than anyone in NATO as a percentage of GDP. As a result, Trump thinks the country is pulling its weight, because it is, and he has tried to reinforce that behavior. Go back to July, and in the midst of a Russian drone attack on Ukraine, a Polish consulate also got hit. Poland was frustrated with the situation and wanted to push back. That led to a few phone calls. And in short order, the current system of Ukrainian armaments came into place, where European countries place orders with the United States, and the United States prioritizes those orders over existing contracts. But following Russia's attack overnight, now the question turns to what the West will do next to stop further incursions. Hey, at least we now have Trump's first thoughts. What's with Russia violating Poland's airspace with drones? I don't know. You tell me. Here we go! And indeed, that is how we will conclude. How will NATO respond? To some degree, we already have an answer. Poland declared that it wanted to invoke Article 4 of the North Atlantic Treaty. Well, this press briefing from Rutte came after the North Atlantic Council had already met to discuss the situation, in light of Poland's request for Article 4 consultations. You know, this is exactly why the Brussels headquarters exists. When there is a problem in the world, there is no scrambling to figure out how to meet to discuss what happens next. You already have 32 ambassadorial-level missions sitting in Brussels, and they can all just go downstairs, sit in the North Atlantic Council chamber, and iron things out immediately after they happen. No need to figure out how to coordinate 32 world leaders to all fly somewhere. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, Article 4? What the heck is Article 4? The cheeky answer is that it is the article that comes before Article 5. But it is also not exactly a cheeky answer because it kind of is the thing that comes before Article 5. You all know of Article 5 as the "an attack against one is an attack against all" clause of the North Atlantic Treaty. And as aggressive as Russia's actions overnight may have been, this was not an attack in the way that the North Atlantic Treaty conceives of an attack. There was no clear purpose behind the drone flight paths, and it is not even clear that Russia intended to cause any damage. It is better classified as a Russian probe, trying to tease out how the West will respond, both militarily and politically. As a result, Article 5 does not quite apply to the situation. However, that is exactly why Article 4 exists. The parties will consult together whenever, in the opinion of any of them, the territorial integrity, political independence, or security of any of the parties is threatened. Let's forgive the lack of an Oxford comma there, and instead focus on what it means. As I mentioned earlier, there have only been 7 invocations of Article 4 in history. The most recent one occurred shortly after this televised address, in which Putin declared a special military operation against Ukraine. You have already seen Article 4 in action earlier in this video. That enhanced forward presence in Poland, that came out of Poland, Latvia, and Lithuania invoking Article 4 after the Russian annexation of Crimea. It is basically a call to get everyone coordinated on how to handle a major political or military threat to the alliance. It would be silly if NATO had to sit around and wait for an actual attack to get its affairs in order, and so Article 4 serves as a middle ground. As for what happens next, well, now we have reached the tricky part. NATO operates under consensus rules, meaning that everyone has to be on board for decisive action to take place. Everyone means everyone, so keep that in mind. Side payments can grease the wheels, but that still requires extra negotiations and consensus building. Even with that caveat, you would expect some enhanced NATO coverage in Poland as a bare minimum response. Don't forget coverage along Russia's Kaliningrad exclave. Beyond that, there are a couple of stronger responses that are unlikely to fly under a NATO flag, but could nonetheless be born out of NATO consultations. One is to open up long-range munitions to Ukraine. If drones are the problem, then destroy the drones before they ever fly off the ground. The Biden administration had already lifted some of those restrictions for U.S. weapons before the Trump administration brought them back earlier this year. Back during the Biden administration, though, not much happened in terms of Russian escalation against the West during that window. There may still be some escalation risk there today, but they appear to be manageable. You can also have some license for creativity here. Rather than give Ukraine your own long-range weapons, you could just give Ukraine all of the component pieces to build something like that itself. That way, it is still technically a Ukrainian missile striking a Russian target, and you can continue along with your escalation theater as you were before. The other option is to move air defenses into Ukraine proper. You know that Russia is going to be kicking and screaming in response. The Kremlin has already said that any Western coalition forces in Ukraine are legitimate targets. But if one believes the Kremlin's prior cover story about this being a simple case of drones going off course, then the simple response is that Europe has a right to make sure that the drones never leave Ukraine. That means shooting them down in Ukraine. And it is not like the West would be the first side to internationalize the conflict. This would actually be less escalatory, because unlike the North Korean forces shooting at Ukrainian soldiers, no coalition forces would be killing Russian soldiers. Of course, Europe cannot be sure where any missile over the western edge of Ukraine might ultimately go, which means that if you do this, you have to shoot them all down. Oh no, that implies that Ukraine gets high-quality defensive coverage for about a quarter of its country. What a shame that Ukraine could then reposition its own air defenses further east. And that, in turn, indicates that Europe has to be more directly involved in the conflict than the current status quo of weapons broker. In other words, something has to start happening in-country. Otherwise, Russia gets to keep retaining a de facto veto on any sort of ceasefire process by simply choosing to continue marching soldiers westward. Well, if the seal has to be broken somewhere, this is as reasonable of a place as any to do it. Whether they will is a different story, of course, and the slow movement on this front over the last year should tell us everything that we need to know about the likelihood of such stronger measures. Meanwhile, this is as reasonable of a place as any to tell you about 2 excellent books about the war. Check the video description for more information about them. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.